So this is the courtroom observation presentation by Nigel Bush. So the proceedings that I observed for my courtroom observation presentation were pretrial conference, first appearance, and a sentencing hearing. Now, a pretrial conference is just a meeting between the court actors that so they can resolve any issues that need to be resolved before a trial. And a first appearance is an initial appearance for the defendant to ensure that they have all their knowledge about their charges and their rights. And last, we have the sentencing hearing, which is basically just a hearings for the defendant to receive their punishment for whatever the charges that they were indicted for. Observation 1, courtroom actor demographics. We have the first defendant was male. He was black. He was about 6 feet and about 200 pounds. And he was in his early 30s. The first observation defense attorney or public defender was female, white, and she was mid to late 20s. And the lead prosecutor in this observation was male, white, early 40s. And another prosecutor in the case was female, black, and early 40s. The judge of the case was male, white, and mid-50s. My observation 2, courtroom actor demographics. The defendant was a male Hispanic, about 5'8", 160 pounds, in his late 30s. And the defense attorney or public defender was male, white, mid to late 20s. And the lead prosecutor in this case was male, white, late 50s. And as well as another prosecutor that was male, white, early 30s. The judge in this case was male, white, mid-50s. And for my last observation, number 3, the courtroom actor demographics, we have the defendant was a male, white, about 5'8", 150 pounds, and he was late 30s. The lead defense attorney, or not in this case, public defender, was male, white, mid to late 50s. And the partner defense attorney was, the partner of the defense attorney was a female, white, mid to late 60s. The lead prosecutor in this case was male, white, late 50s, and the prosecutor on the case was another male, white, early 30s. The judge in this case was a male, white, early 60s, and all of the bailiffs in this case, there were a lot of them. They were male, white, mid-30s. And so the similarities between all these that I can see was younger defendants. And one thing that I saw that was very similar between all of them was that the prosecutors were mostly male, white, older men between like 40s to 60s. As well as the judges. In almost every case, the judge was a white male, and he was above 50. Now for observation 1, the notes that I had put down were, it was just a pre-trial conference. It was supposed to be about an hour long, and the actual proceedings that took place were about maybe 30 to 45 minutes. And all that happened in this case was the pre-trial conference. It got rescheduled for October 21st, 2024. They presented the defendant's charges, which were strangulation, confinement, intimidation, possession of marijuana, domestic battery, in front of a child under the age of 16. And so observation 2, it was a little longer. It was the defendant's, which was the defendant's first appearance. The defendant, I noticed in this case, he looked concerned and kind of restless. I wasn't sure if it was like a remorseful look or if he was more concerned about himself, but he did look concerned. And he looked exhausted, like very tired. There was a public defender in this case, and the defendant's charges were Class 4 felony, criminal damage to property. The judge announced the conditions of the pretrial release. And then the warrant, which he had previously, was no longer active, and the defendant returned away with the bailiff. And so for observation 3, this one was, it was very more content compared to my first 2 observations, even though it was just a sentencing hearing. But there were multiple bailiffs present. The defendant, most of the entire case or the entire court proceeding, the defendant's head was bowed down. His eyes were wide, and he looked very concerned. Like, he was very into the case. The team of attorneys, there was a team of district attorneys at the prosecutor's desk, the plaintiff, and then the attorneys were prepping papers the entire time. The defendant entered a guilty plea for 2 charges of 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder with a deadly weapon, 1 count of aggravated battery causing serious bodily injury with a weapon. And the entire atmosphere and everyone's attitude in the entire courtroom was very serious. In this case, this was a very violent crime that was committed, so everyone was very serious. This was a very deep case. The defense in this case was requiring specialized treatment for a mental disorder that is not related to substance abuse or addiction or for a physical disability. And the defense was arguing that the defendant was showing remorse and was too young at the time of the crime to fully comprehend the consequences. There were doctor's reports, school records, and transcripts of depositions that were presented to the prosecutor for the defense. The defense also presented a neurologist as a witness. The defendant was crying during this proceeding. The victims had delivered impact statements, which are like statements basically describing to the court how this event impacted them. The judge ended up sentencing the defendant to a life in prison, and the defense argued that 227.25 months were credited, and they ended up being credited towards the sentence. The parents of the defendants began to cry. The defendant's eyes closed while they were being sentenced, and after the sentencing, the victims hugged their loved ones and cried together. Now, the courtroom actors and their roles. These are the roles that we learned, the definitions of the roles of each courtroom actor that were presented in our material. We have the defendant. The defendant arrests. At arrest, it transformed a person from being a suspect to being a defendant. The foundational roles of the criminal court. the determination of a defendant's guilt, the pronouncement of his punishment, and the protection of his constitutional rights are required. Now we have the defense attorney. The defense attorney promotes the interest and protects the rights of their clients. And it puts the prosecutor's case to the test. So basically it just challenges anything that the prosecutor brings up in order to put the defendant away. The prosecutor's role is to represent either the government in the prosecution of criminal offenses or the government and the governmental interests or the specific needs of citizens beyond criminal prosecutions. The judge, we have authorized public law officers. They are authorized public law officers. They hear disputes, administer the law, and preside over courts of justice. They do the best to facilitate the administration of justice in the American court system. And we have the jury, even though the proceedings that I observed didn't have much of the jury aspect to them. A trial by jury is just made up of members of a society, and it determines the condemnation of a person. Juries have come to dispute not guilty verdicts in high-profile cases. Criminal defendants represented by a public defender rarely get acquitted. And in my case, 2 out of 3 of the proceedings that I observed were cases taken by public defenders. And this is a role that wasn't very much talked about throughout our material, but the bailiff, they ensure the safety and the order of a courtroom and uphold the court's policies, and they also assist the judge with other things. So throughout my observations, the public defenders, even though they get a bad rep and they're kind of looked down upon, they did a very good and thorough job representing the clients that I observed. They did everything that needed to be done, and they did good overall. The defense attorney in observation 3 presented evidence for the sentencing. So the defense attorney and their team in observation 3, they did a phenomenal job of getting the client's needs heard, because any other attorney, they didn't have to necessarily go out of their way to dig deep into the client's history, but that is their job, to advocate for their client. And the defense attorney and their team in observation 3, they did a very good job of making sure that their client's needs were heard by the prosecutor and the judge and the court in general. Judges in all 3 cases, they effectively did their jobs. In the last case, the judge heard, well, it was time for the judge to sentence the defendant, and so they heard the victim impact statements, and they heard statements from the defendant's parents, and they used all that information. They gathered all that information and used their own discretion to sentence the defendant. And bailiffs, they successfully executed their roles as well. They don't get talked about as much, but they play a very big role in the court proceedings. And so last, I have the difference between TV versus reality. In television, court proceedings are presented as dramatic. There's a lot of exaggerations and very simplified legal proceedings in plain English use. The process is also sped up for faster resolutions. And in reality, the court proceedings are very serious, and it's a very heavy environment. You can feel the tension in the room. And it's also, there are very long court proceedings. There are multiple different parts to the court process, which each take a very long time. It can take up to, resolutions may take up to months or even years. And then another big difference between reality versus TV is that there is a lot of legal jargon used in reality versus the simplified English version that is shown on TV.